Parashat Ki Teitzei concludes with the obligation to remember what Amalek did to you. Zachar et asher asa lecha Amalek b'derech b'tzeitchem miMitzrayim. Now, the obligation of war against Amalek actually is mentioned twice in the Torah in Sefer Shemot as well as Sefer Dvarim. And the Mefarshim, many of them, take a realistic approach, assuming that this is talking about a real concrete war against a flesh and blood enemy who deserves to be fought against because they fought a war unprovoked and against the norms of just war and rebelled against God. But there are differences in the passages that talk about Amalek that really demand that we kind of reinterpret and look really closely at what's going on here. In Sefer Shemot, the obligation of war against Amalek appears within the context of a crisis of faith. Bnei Israel essentially don't have water and they want to know, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu im ayin, is Hashem with us or is he not? There's no explanation of why Amalek fought. Hashem is said to be the one who will blot out the memory of Amalek. The only instruction that Bnei Israel is given is to write a memorial. And there's some weird incident with Moshe's hands, which we'll talk about in a second. In Sefer Dvarim, the obligation of war against Amalek appears in the context of the Torah talking about ethical business practices and people who are dishonest as disgusting or abhorrent in God's eyes. There is a description of an unprovoked or surprised attack by Amalek. We're given a positive command to remember, to blot out the memory, and to not forget. But the realistic approach doesn't take into account the context here. It doesn't take into account context, that in one instance, there's the context is a crisis of faith. In another instance, it's ethical business practices. It doesn't take into account the notion that Moshe's hands need to be propped up, at which point, by the way, they are described as faith-inducing, Vayhi yadav emunah, and that the presence or absence of Amalek in the Psukim correlate with the presence or absence of emunah, of faith in Bnei Israel. When Moshe's hands are raised, or when people are ethical in business practices, faith prevails. And actually, it's the lack of faith that precipitates the onslaught of Amalek to begin with. And so Amalek in the Psukim themselves seem to represent a lack of faith. When Amalek is winning, it's because faith is not there. When faith is there, Amalek fails. And that's why it's no surprise that there's a trend within the commentaries, within Jewish scholarship, to interpret the war with Amalek not as a physical war against an enemy, but as a conceptual war. Some of the Mefarshim talk about the war with Amalek as a metaphysical war between the forces of good and evil, or a cultural clash between the sword and the pen, or an internal psychological struggle that takes place within each human being. And it's important to remember, it's important to keep in mind that these scholars who are interpreting the war with Amalek conceptually are not motivated by personal ideology or sensitivity against the notion of war. They're not even motivated by a desire to be innovative or creative, but because the Torah itself, the Psukim themselves, are demanding that Amalek be seen conceptually, are demanding the metaphorization of Amalek. And so this process of metaphorization is completely warranted and actually necessary, and gives the parsha a whole new meaning when we're no longer talking about a war against a specific people, but about the human ethical condition. That when people are engaging in ethical business practices, or when they feel the presence of God in their lives, Amalek is not there. The Rambam says that the war with Amalek is one of the mitzvot that Bnei Israel are commanded to do immediately upon entering Eretz Israel. What does the war with Amalek have to do with that? Well, if you think about it in this conceptual way, Amalek represents the lack of faith. So as soon as we enter Eretz Israel, we have to be aware of the possibility that there's going to be a lack of faith. We have to remember what Amalek can do to you, what Amalek can do to the Jewish soul, the human mind, or the Jewish mind. And so depending upon which conceptual approach you take, Amalek is seen as a barrier to God's presence in the world. And so when we enter Eretz Israel, we have to remove those barriers. What we're doing is we're not thinking about the enemy. That's not what Amalek is here. We're thinking about who we are. It's more about who we are and less about anybody else. And when we enter into Eretz Israel, we're really entering into our own. We're thinking about our relationship with God. We're thinking about the level, the extent of our faith. And we're thinking about ultimately creating a godly society. Shabbat Shalom.